As I already mentioned, I'm Armen Marsoobian, followed by David Pettigrew, my colleague, who will speak about the Bosnian genocide, and we will conclude with David Simon on the Rwandan Tutsi genocide. So let us begin. Let me just say a couple of things about myself. I'm a professor, as I said, of philosophy here at Southern Connecticut State, but I myself am a child of a genocide survivors. Now, we're talking about the Armenian genocide. We're talking about a period 1915 to 1923. And I'm not that old, but both my parents were children during this period of the genocide in Ottoman Turkey. My mother was 4 years old and my father was 6 years old. But as we have noted, the process of genocide in many cases doesn't happen with a single event. And generally it's the case that the Armenian genocide is seen to begin in 1915 and concludes ultimately in 1923 with the founding of the Turkish Republic. And there were many moments in that 8-year period where the violence increased and decreased. I'm also a moral philosopher. I teach ethics, and I also am a researcher and scholar in issues of human rights and genocide studies in general, and I spend a lot of time on the other genocides, not just the Armenian genocide, but of course, given my background and my personal connection to the Armenian genocide, this is an area I've written about and taught extensively. I've taught courses here in comparative genocide studies at Southern, but I've also taught at Columbia University graduate courses that focus on the Armenian genocide. I want to ask you, as we begin, how many of you at all deal in any way, even briefly, with the Armenian genocide in your teaching? Can anyone raise your hand? Okay, yes, 3 people. Okay, and that's not surprising. And I'll say a few things about why that is the case, and try to make a case for you to incorporate certainly more into your teaching related to the Armenian genocide, knowing full well that you have limited time, and of course the Holocaust has been the primary focus in many school curriculums over the last couple of decades. I mean, when you raise your hands, I guess that it's a similar question that I ask in my undergraduate courses here on comparative genocide, in which we deal with the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, Rwanda, Cambodia, sometimes with Darfur and Bosnia. I ask my students how many have heard of the Armenian genocide. And I'm lucky if there's actually one student who happens to raise their hand, and it usually has to do with the fact that they had a good friend who happens to be Armenian and has their last name IAN or YAN, and because for Armenians this is sort of the central event in unfortunately the central event in a proud 3,000-year history of Armenians on this planet. It's been a defining event for generations since the Armenian genocide that began in 1915. I'm wondering if, how many of you, when you have heard of the Armenian genocide, have heard it mentioned in some connection to the Holocaust? Often it's the case that when people refer to the Armenian genocide, they begin with actually a quote by Hitler on August 22nd, 1939, about a week, 10 days, I believe, before the invasion of Poland. Hitler was speaking to his commanders in the Wehrmacht, and this is referred to as the Ober-Salzburg speech. I won't quote the whole speech, but the portion that's often referenced, and it's certainly referenced by Armenians when they make the case that there is an important historical connection between what happened to the Armenians and what happened into the Holocaust. And the fact that most people do not remember or know of the Holocaust, but of the Armenian genocide, excuse me. Most people don't know or don't remember the Armenian genocide. Hitler certainly knew of the Armenian genocide. And he remarked in this speech, and I'll quote just from the end of it, he says, "I have placed my death head formation in readiness for the present only in the east," because he's about to cross the German-Polish border and invade, "with orders to them to send to death mercilessly and without compassion men, women, and children of Polish derivation and language. Only thus shall we gain the living space, the Lebensraum, which we need. Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" And the important connection between what Hitler was thinking about and what the Young Turk Ottoman government was thinking about back in 1915 is the elimination of this minority within its borders. And for Hitler, it was an elimination of not only the Jews, but also ultimately the Poles and all the Slavic peoples in the East to expand the German Aryan race across all of Europe. So what I'm going to do is to really focus on three questions. Why study the Armenian genocide? And what are the obstacles to teaching the Armenian genocide? And also, what are some approaches to teaching the Armenian genocide? To the question of why study the Armenian genocide, I will argue, and again, please interrupt at any time. I will argue that the centrality of the Armenian genocide to international human rights law and the concept, there's a centrality of the genocide to international human rights law and the concept of genocide. And this is an important connection that is often not noted, but it's been increasingly studied in recent decades. The first formal use of the phrase crime or crimes against humanity, in a sense, in a public government statement, happened with regard to the Armenian genocide. We always wonder, where do these terms come from? And in particular, this was the Allied powers in the First World War. And when you're thinking of of the Armenian genocide and the kinds of parallels that you could make when you're teaching the Holocaust, you realize that when you teach the Holocaust, you're going to have to talk about World War II, and it's often taught in that context of world history, or in US history, the US role in World War II, and Holocaust becomes part of that curriculum. And there's a certain parallel to what happened to the Armenians. It was during wartime, and this is a pattern that we see with other genocides. They don't have to be during cases of world wars, but they often take place in civil wars, in wars of liberation, where these events take place. And I have up here on the screen a reference to the first formal use on May 24th, 1915, during the First World War. The Allies, and these were Britain, France, and Russia, issued a statement, and they were fully aware of the violence and the deportations and the massacres that had begun 1 month before. So we think of this period in the early part of the 20th century as they didn't have, the kind of instant mass communication where, we know, within seconds these events around the world. But the German, the Turkish and the cooperating German authorities within the Ottoman Empire were both singled out by the Allies. This quote, and I'll quote it here, states, and this was issued to the Ottoman government in view of these new crimes of Ottoman Empire against humanity and civilization, the Allied governments announced publicly to the Sublime Porte, that's the Turkish government, that phrase is used, that they will hold personally responsible for these crimes all members of the Ottoman government, as well as those of their agents who are implicated in such matters. Okay? So it was a clear statement by the Allies that these crimes would not get away unpunished. Unfortunately, with regard to the Armenian genocide, and this is where, again, you can make comparisons to the Holocaust, the perpetrators did get away with the crime. And this brings us to another important connection, and this is the connection to the concept of genocide. As some of you know, probably all of you know, the word genocide didn't exist in 1950. There were various terms to refer to what was happening to the Armenians, usually massacres, extermination. Even the word Holocaust is used with regard to what happened. Armenians had their own words to describe the events. But and David had referenced Raphael Lemkin, who conceptualized the idea of the crime of genocide and came up with the term. And I say why he was puzzled, and this is a quote of Lemkin. Why is the killing of 1 million a lesser crime than the killing of an individual? That quote is in reference to the Armenian genocide and not the Holocaust. In his autobiography, Lemkin states that he first became obsessed with the relationship of law to mass murder of civilians when he read about the massacres of the Armenians and the fact that the perpetrators of the crime went unpunished. Let's see if this works. I'm hoping it will. So far, so good. And we see Raphael Lemkin. Can you hear this?
Matters about the United Nations. Dr. Lemkin is the man who created the word genocide and really has fought this thing from long, long ago. Dr. Lemkin, could you give us a little background on how you came to be interested in this genocide fight originally?
Gladly, Mr. Howe. It leads me very far back to my childhood. Everybody has sentimental memories from childhood, and everybody has a book he loved most. One of my inspiration in this field was a book by Sienkiewicz, Quo Vadis, which described the terrible sufferings of early Christians. Later on, I became interested in genocide because it happened so many times. It happened to the Armenians, and after the Armenians got to a very rough deal at the Versailles Conference because the criminals who were guilty of genocide were not punished. You know that they organized a organization, a terroristic organization, which took justice in their own hands. The trial of Talat Pasha in 1921 in Berlin is very instructive. A man whose mother was killed in genocide case killed Talat Pasha, and he told the court that he did it because his mother came in his sleep and incited him many times. Here, the murder of your mother, will do a thing about it. And so he committed a crime. So you see, as a lawyer, I thought that crime should not be punished by the victims, but should be punished by a court, by international law.
And you took it up then again when Hitler came to power in Germany, didn't you?
Correct, in 1933, and there was not only the case of genocide which interested me, the case in Near East. I would like to mention the country. There are two cases in 1933, and then I said to myself, now being a lawyer, I'm going to do something about it. And I submitted a draft convention to a committee of a conference of legal experts, which were connected with the League of Nations. And however, no action was taken. And then, however, but Hitler took action, and that precipitated conscience of the world to do so.
Okay. Let me see if I can. Okay, I can go back. I hope you heard some of that. This is Raphael Lemkin telling, and this is repeated in his autobiography, telling us this is the autobiography that's called Totally Unofficial. It came out in a beautiful edition from Yale University Press in 2013, in which he writes about, as a young man, hearing about the Armenian genocide, and then as a young legal student, realizing that in the case of Talat Pasha, who was the Minister of the Interior, who was one of the chief architects of the genocide, who escaped punishment, he had been arrested. These are quotes, I'm not going to repeat them. He was arrested and, along with other leadership, put in prison in Malta, but for various geopolitical reasons, eventually all the perpetrators were released, and Talat Pasha had escaped. He wasn't arrested, actually, but he wound up being aided by the Germans, and he left Constantinople in a submarine and wound up in Berlin, and he was assassinated. Lemkin refers to this young man, Talarian, who lost his whole family during the genocide, assassinating him. And Talarian is put on trial for killing one person, but the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide, who killed between 1 million and 1.5 million, were not prosecuted. And this is where the idea of law has to come into effect to try to deal with this international crime against groups, against collectivities. He says at the end of these quotes, at the moment my worries about the murder of the innocent became more meaningful to me. I didn't know all the answers, but I felt that a law against this type of racial or religious murder must be adopted by the world. And in that video segment, he refers to 1933, when he actually developed legislation, and he took it to a League of Nations conference. He didn't have the word yet at that point. He referred to genocide as acts of barbarism, barbarity, and vandalism. Vandalism referring to the cultural aspect of it, barbarity referring to the actual killing or violence. And these are quotes, again, from his autobiography that connect directly, ultimately, to the Genocide Convention. He was already, in 1933, before, just prior to Hitler coming into power, he was still, for over a decade, focused on this question of genocide. I'm going to let's see if this works. Okay. So I'm going to now, as I said, I have 3 questions I'm dealing with. The second of those questions are obstacles to teaching the Armenian genocide. And I've mentioned some of these before. Not only do people not know about the Armenian genocide, many people don't know what Armenia is or where it is. I ask my students, I always find it fun to have a sort of a geography question at the beginning of my class. I don't know if you run into this with your students in middle school and high school. They don't know where these places are in the world. They don't know where Darfur is or where Myanmar or Burma. It's certainly the case with Armenia, and that's been something that from my childhood I've always been asked by my friends, "Oh, you're Armenian. Where is that?" You know. So currently it's a small, I say geopolitically isolated country, which most students cannot identify on a map. But Armenia, the Republic of Armenia now, which is landlocked in the Caucasus, is only about 20% of what was historic Armenia. Most of historic Armenia is now part of eastern Turkey. The other element or obstacle is the fact that we are a very small minority. There are about 800,000 to maybe, this is stretching it, I think, when I look at this figure of 1.5 million Armenians, most of them located in California and Southern California, in the greater Boston area and in New York City. Certainly, if you go to Southern California and you go to LA, that's where you'll find the greatest concentration. In Glendale, Hollywood, Pasadena, those are high concentrations of Armenians. Glendale has almost 50% of the population. Glendale is a city within LA County of about 100,000 people. About half of them are Armenians. The other obstacle, of course, it's an event that's over 100 years ago, it's sometimes harder to make that contemporary connection that is sometimes more easily made with the contemporary genocides or with the Holocaust and World War II, because people know quite a bit about World War II. While the First World War is, in a sense, sometimes underappreciated in our history curriculums, we're going through now a process of the 100th anniversary of various events in the First World War, coming to the end of that war. Then, with regard to the Armenian genocide, there was this notion of forgetting, and there was a certain parallel with the Holocaust, but this is quite different in the sense that with the Holocaust, Germany was defeated, the Ottoman Empire was defeated, but ultimately the Ottoman Empire became the Republic of Turkey, and no one was punished. With regard to the Holocaust, some of the perpetrators were punished, and we know that not all of them or most of them, but many of them were. And with regard to the Armenian genocide, because of geopolitical reasons I won't get into, the world moved on. The U.S. saw itself, its international, its national security interests in the Republic of Turkey and became complicit in the active Turkish denial of the Armenian genocide. And we talked about the Holocaust denial. The Armenian genocide, unlike the Holocaust denial, no, well, I might qualify that, because with the Holocaust denial, we have Iran, and there is a certain governmental credence given to the Holocaust denial by elements of the Iranian government. I wouldn't say it's 100% uniform, but Iran is seen as sort of a pariah state by many in the West. But with Turkey, Turkey is a NATO ally and has been a close ally of the United States up until this last few weeks with the Trump administration. But it's been going sour for a little while. You know, people don't even remember that the Turks provided the second or third largest contingent of soldiers fighting in South Korea during the Korean War. But there's been a very active campaign by the Turkish government of denial of the genocide. It was civil war, there were deaths on both parts, there's no intent, we don't have the documents to demonstrate it. So when your students start looking up information about the Armenian genocide, they will come across a number of websites. They will, if they go to the Foreign Ministry of the Republic of Turkey, you will find a lot of material denying the Armenian genocide. You will see a website called Tall Tale Armenians, which again provides a lot of genocide denial. So one needs to be careful. On the website we'll have from the State Education Department, we will flag all the appropriate websites for the Armenian genocide. And finally, unlike the Holocaust and more recent genocides, there are few if any survivors. We used to have every April 24th in the state capitol to commemorate. April 24th is the date that the Armenian genocide began, when Armenian intellectuals and leadership were arrested and put in prison, and many of them killed in Constantinople in April 24, 1915. That's the date every year where Armenians commemorate the genocide. You saw that opening picture of the eternal flame with the flowers around it. That's the genocide memorial in Yerevan in Armenia, on the hillside called Tsitsanakabert. And every April 24th, anywhere between 1 million and 1.5 million Armenians in a country that, well, it's about 2 million plus Armenians, come to that memorial and place those flowers around the eternal flame. And those flowers reach up to 10, 12 feet. It's an amazing thing to see. But there are very few genocide survivors of the Armenian events, and they've all died. But at that commemoration in the state capitol, we used to always honor those survivors, and now for the last 2 years, there's been no one to honor. Up until 2 years ago, we had at least one person there. And this is not moving. Okay. So let's get to talk a little about the approaches to teaching the Armenian genocide. I've identified 3, and of course, some of these are more appropriate to the social studies curriculum. Some of them might be less appropriate. The historical approaches, either in the context of U.S. history or world history. And in world history and U.S. history, of course, World War I is where this would be taught. But unlike most teaching of the First World War, little is said about what happened in the East and in the Middle East, aside maybe some references to Lawrence of Arabia and what happened in the Middle East. But there's very little about the war against the Ottomans. And And actually, it was the collapse in the east of the Ottoman Empire and the Bulgarians, who were allies of the Germans against the French and the British and ultimately the United States, that led to the armistice that Germany agreed to. So it wasn't a defeat on the Western Front, though we know from the history that the focus is always on the Western Front. This is one area where one can approach the genocide. Another one, and I'll point you to some resources in all three areas. The other, and this is, I know for middle schools, the literary and artistic approaches that use novels, memoirs, poetry, visual arts, and performing arts, and film. This is actually one of the ways I teach the genocide. I approach it, all the genocides, not just the Armenian genocide, through the arts. And this is where I can, and there was a mention made of this earlier, about how do the students react. I find it very effective in using the arts because they get emotionally involved in the material. And then, of course, you have to bring them out of that sort of emotional reaction and get them to start critically analyzing what had happened, what the causes are. But I find, and I do this at Columbia and I do this here at Southern, that using the arts as the segue into discussions of genocide works very effectively. And the last approach, which has also been mentioned by others, is human rights and social justice approach that places the genocide in the context of other genocides and social justice issues, the Holocaust, Darfur, and the U.S. Civil Rights Movement with regard to hate crimes and the problems we're facing today with the alt-right and neo-Nazism. So just these will be little snippets. The historical approach, U.S. and world history. An example, I'll give you an example using an individual story. This is the ambassador Henry Morgenthau Sr. The Morgenthau's are a very distinguished Jewish American family. Henry Morgenthau was the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. His son, Henry Morgenthau Jr., was U.S. Secretary of the Treasury and played a big role in trying to push the FDR administration with regard to the persecution of the Jews. And the senior's grandson was, for a long time, Attorney General in Manhattan, in the District of Manhattan, and worked against hate crimes and discrimination in that role. So I just want to see if this works, because I've been talking too much, and some of you will probably be aware of this website. This is Facing History in Ourselves, and there is quite a bit of material here.
The war presented the Ottoman triumvirate, this new leadership, with an opportunity to solve a problem. We have to think of World War I as a screen behind which genocide could be carried out. As the arrests and the mass killings begin to happen in Armenian sections of cities, towns, and villages all over Turkey, the U.S. consuls stationed in those parts of Turkey are sending vivid descriptions of what's happening to Ambassador Henry Morgenthau, who is stationed in Constantinople.
I have the honor to further supplement my reports of June 30th and July 11th in regard to the expulsion of the Armenians from this region, or to speak more correctly, the wholesale massacre of these Armenians. It has been no secret that the plan was to destroy the Armenian race as a race, but the methods used have been more cold-blooded and barbarous, if not more effective, than I had at first supposed. It seems to be fully established now that practically all who have been sent away from here have been deliberately shot or otherwise killed within 1 or 2 days after their departure. I do not believe there has ever been a massacre in the history of the world so general and thorough as that which is now being perpetrated in this region, or that a more fiendish, diabolical scheme has ever been conceived by the mind of man.
When he starts to get the dispatches and eyewitness accounts, he's shocked, horrified, engaged. Quickly, he becomes a voice of conscience.
Okay, I'll stop there. This is a beautiful short video. It could be used in class. This is on Facing History on Ourselves. There's a whole curriculum on the website. I'll talk a little more about that toward the end. But here's an approach where you can look at a particular individual's response, and I guess this gets to the question of those who acted heroically in times of horror. Ambassador Morgenthau was one such an individual. There were many, including many American missionaries who also worked and saved others, and there are examples of that in my own family's history of how we survived, my family survived the genocide. So getting back to...
He becomes a...
Okay. A much more contemporary, and this is approaching genocide through the arts, and I love using film, and you know there's so many films and so much material that you could use with the Holocaust, and that wasn't the case with the Armenian genocide up until about 10 or 12 years ago, and in the build-up to the 100th anniversary, which was in 2015, a number of films were produced. One, unfortunately, didn't come out until 2017. It was a Hollywood feature called The Promise. It's a film that is in the typical sort of Hollywood vein of historical drama, but the background, the history of this is very, very reflective of the actual events. Of course, as a Hollywood film, it has to have a love story and a love triangle, but this is another way of catching the students. And of course, there's always a very catchy trailer to this film.
Be careful. Thank you.
The world is at your feet, Mikhail. Do us proud.
You're going to become a doctor?
Yes, it's my passion.
Christopher Myers.
Chris is a star reporter for the Associated Press. A toast to old friends and new.
Anna is a fine woman, Mikhail.
You make me feel like I'm home.
She's very fond of you. It's obvious. It's very dangerous for Armenians right now. I want to get you out of here.
It's not safe for me.
Okay. Of course, trailers are always eye-catching, and this one certainly is. But this film came out with, as you as I will show you here, a very extensive study guide that can be used, which gives you the history, the background of the events in the film, and they've also provided a lesson plan. Usually with Hollywood films, we don't get lesson plans. I think this is somewhat unique. And these are all free and can be downloaded. As you see, there's a download link for this. The human rights approach and social justice approach, I think, is also captured nicely in a film, Watchers of the Sky, which deals with a number of different genocides. And this is a film by Edith Belsberg. And this is a film also that has an extensive educational apparatus with it. And this is a documentary, not a Hollywood film, but the production is beautifully done. And there's a website, as you see here, with a link to educational resources, and you can just get a feeling of the film. And it deals with Lemkin, and it deals with the Armenian genocide and the connection of the two. And this is Lemkin's quote.
The universal capacity to carry out harms of great magnitude. Lemkin knew that no one was safe. Raphael Lemkin was a Polish Jew, and when Hitler invaded Poland, 47 members of his family were herded up and killed.
I became interested in terrible suffering because it happened so many times. I said to myself, I'm going to do something about it.
Lemkin came with a new idea, to transform these massacres into a crime.
Something clicked in him. Maybe if I had a better word, maybe then governments would ban the mass murder of civilians. Genocide. So he has a word. Now what?
How does one little guy go about trying to reform the world?
Lemkin turned himself into a one-man mobbing machine.
The convention is adopted by unanimous vote. Let's open up the world and let light and knowledge come in.
Today is a milestone.
No criminal court has filed genocide charges against the president of Sudan.
This monstrous conflict has to come to an end.
I'm myself a survivor of genocide.
These people are waiting for our protection. We don't need to wait until he finishes his work.
That was Lemkin's point, that perpetrators will be watched, that they will be accountable.
I think at the same time we have to stop, and we say we stop here.
The law is a difference between life or death. I cannot fail. We cannot fail.
I always think about the privilege, of getting to try, just to try.
That was Samantha Power, who was for Obama on the National Security Council and eventually UN ambassador to the United States. And she wrote a very important early book in one that is sort of quite readable, that deals with a number of genocides, and it's called A Problem from Hell. I know I'm going on too long, so I just want, and all this material will be available on the website. And one of the important websites, as I've mentioned before, and how many here have used or are familiar with Facing History and Ourselves? Yeah, many of you have. There's an extensive material there about the Armenian genocide, much of it available for free. You can download a whole book that gives you, this is not something that necessarily your students will be reading, but if you want to make sure you're have the kind of background information, this is the place to go. And when you go here, this is the Armenian genocide, and as you see, there's a unit with lesson plans that focus on different topics that could fit into all the three approaches that I've talked about. So there's a lot of material that you could spend a lot of time with, and I urge you to go and look at that website. But again, I know I'm going over time and I'm the moderator, so I have to cut myself off. But the other important site is the Genocide Education Project. And again, there is a URL. This place, this organization has a particular focus on the Armenian genocide, and it has teaching guides and websites. And if I have to write to them, it has a list of curricular requirements. It says currently they're following 11 states require the teaching of the Armenian genocide. Now, Connecticut doesn't quite require the teaching of the Armenian genocide. These 11 states actually, in their mandates, refer to the Armenian genocide. But again, this is a place where you can go for background information, and the teaching guides are very useful. You'll see there's even a 2-day lesson on the Armenian genocide, various books. There are the study guides for The Promise, even an activity called Memorial Garden. This is Greg Stanton's 10 Stages of Genocide. Various books that would be useful, and there's also photography and the voices of survivors. So this is, again, testimony that plays an important part. I'm going to skip there are other important movies that have been made. One of the first was in 2003, Adam Egoyan's Ararat, which David and I teach in our courses on the genocide. The famous Jewish Austrian writer Franz Werfel wrote The 40 Days of Musada. This was an international bestseller. Of course, this is a book you're not going to assign to your students because it's about 1,000 pages, and it's a long read, and it's a difficult read. But when it came out, it was published in 12 languages. It was banned by Hitler. Franz Werfel his life was threatened, and he eventually wound up in the United States. And MGM bought the rights to this book, and Clark Gable was going to star in it. But the Turkish denial of the Armenian genocide was in full force in the 1930s, and Turkey put pressure on the U.S. and the State Department, and this project was killed, and Clark Gable did not star in this film. And again, attempts were made to make this film basically failed because of Turkish denial. These are two more recent films. The Cut, which is unusual because it was done by a German-Turkish filmmaker. So within Turkey, when we talk about Turkish denial, the denial comes to the top from the government. Many people in Turkey, but it's still a very small minority, accept the events that happened there. And then there are important documentary films, including this by Andrew Goldberg. I also have an embedded clip here, but I think I've been talking much too long. I here refer to memoir and testimony. These are important books that I've used in my courses that approach it not in terms of literature, but memoir. Now, memoir takes a sort of middle ground between the novel and the documentary. But one place for testimony is the Shoah Foundation. Now, you would think of the Shoah Foundation is about the Shoah, but their mandate is bigger than the Shoah. And if you go down to collections, you will see they have testimony from survivors of the Armenian genocide. There's both film and audio testimony, and this is just
a lot of rumors about.
This is just an example of what is in their collection. So this is a place where you can send your students if they're working on projects. Okay?
Railable buildings we could see. They were saying about our deportation. They were giving us about 2 weeks to leave Konya. That was Sunday afternoon. We were sitting down. Next thing we saw all the church bells were ringing. We didn't know what it. So church was over.
So here are there are a number of sources. All of these will be up. There's even a book I wrote that is a family memoir, The Fragments of a Lost Homeland, Remembering Armenia, and a number of other websites. And there are also, I have, up on the web, I have family, for my family.
My name is Ara Dildilian. I live in Fonda, Old Trail, New York. I was born in Marsoobian, and Marsoobian is located probably about 50 miles south from Samsun on the Clyde.
Okay, of course I can't play that all, but the photographs here are all taken by my grandfather, who was a photographer in the Ottoman Empire. But I've taken these audio interviews of my uncle, Dildilian, and put them on the web and have used them in exhibitions related to the photography. I also have a video interview with my mother. Sorry, Mom, I'm not going to show you today because I need to conclude. And here I have a list of very accessible fiction about the Armenian genocide. And poetry, and these are two textbooks, sort of textbooks that I've used, the Samantha Power, who I referenced before, The Problem Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, and Adam Jones's Genocide, a comprehensive introduction. With that, I need to conclude because I've gone on too long. So thank you. If you have questions, I can take a few now. And I will be available for sort of the breakout afterwards. Any questions, comments?
Yeah, I would basic history get Peter Balakian to do the narration.
Oh yeah, he has a number of films. You say, how did they get him to do it? I think they got him to do it before he won the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry, because Peter's been very busy for the last 2 years. Peter Balakian is an old friend of mine. We went to college together, undergraduates, and that Black Dog of Fate is his memoir about learning about the Armenian genocide and the issues of denial and forgetting. And he, in that book, he talks about, I first met him as a freshman in college when he was more interested in football, but by the end of his 4 years in a liberal arts college, he was writing poetry and deep into the Armenian history, and he's a Pulitzer Prize winning poet and a writer, and he narrates a number of there's more than one of his videos on that website. And the documentary by Andrew Goldberg, who's done some amazing documentaries, he's also, Peter is interviewed on that also. Stephen.
Is there any sign whatsoever of any Turkish movement on this issue or no?
There had been. I began working in Turkey in about 2009, and by 2013 I had, you saw briefly my uncle and those photographs. I had a major exhibition in Istanbul, and over the next year and a half, I had 4 exhibitions with an increasing sort of openness to talking about these issues. But then things started to close down, starting with the breakdown of the Kurdish peace negotiations, and in the last 2 years, especially after the coup 2 years ago, President Erdogan has been very negative in terms of any kind of questioning of the glorious history of the Turkish Republic. So it becomes increasingly difficult. The people that I worked with in Turkey, almost every one of them has a lawsuit against them. My chief sponsor has been in jail since October, and unfortunately one of the people I worked with actually was killed. So it's a very tenuous situation in Turkey. And then all of that could sort of be brought in because this is an event over 100 years ago, but it still resonates today in our relationship with Turkey and what goes on in Turkey. Okay. Any other questions? So we will move on to my colleague